Hello, friends. I'm Elliot. Welcome back to my channel. And whether you're an author, a reader, or just a lover of words, I invite you to stop what you're doing and join me for a page break. On this episode of the program and on this episode of my channel, I thought I would take a moment to share with you some of the books that I've been reading and some of the books that I would highly recommend you add to your to-be-read pile. And so what got me thinking about how to do this was I have a good friend who works in business and finance. And when I talk with him about how things are going, one of the things that he always talks about, one of the things that he always tells me is quarters, and always refers to things in quarters: quarter one, quarter two, quarter three. Well, not being a business and finance person, it took me a little while to realize how important that is. Long story short, in business and finance, and you may know somebody who works in this industry and they can confirm this, the year is divided up into quarters. So quarter one is the first 4 months of the year, quarter two is the second 4 months of the year, so on and so forth, all the way through till the end of the year. So that got me thinking, why not share on the channel some of the books that I've been reading in quarter number one, which is the first 4 months of 2022, and share with you some of the ones that really stood out to me and some of the ones that I really, really liked, and explain why I really, really liked them. Give you a brief review or a brief summary of what I enjoyed most about those books. So I thought I would do that today. Now, I have read far more than what I'm sharing with you today. I didn't want this episode to be, 45 minutes or an hour long, but I thought I would share with you some different books that I've been reading from different genres and different subject matters that you might want to add to your to-be-read pile as you start thinking about moving through spring, as we get into summer of 2022, and you're thinking about vacation and traveling. Nothing is better than traveling with a stack of books or going to the beach and sitting by the ocean, getting you a nice cold drink and listening to the waves hit your feet or hit the shore, and enjoy a good book, or going to the mountains and it's relaxing and peaceful and quiet and just sitting out by the campfire with something cold to drink and a good book. And so you might be thinking about, what should I add to my to-be-read pile as I head into late spring, early summer? Well, maybe this will give you some suggestions. So I'm just going to reach behind me here, grab from my stack, and share with you what I have been reading recently and why I love these books. The first book that I'm going to recommend is probably one that you have heard a lot about. It's been getting a lot of buzz and a lot of publicity. It is Eli Craner's debut novel. It is called Don't Know Tough. And you can see it here. You see the football field and the goalposts on the front cover. That is because it has a significant connection to the book. And so this book is set in Denton, Arkansas, and it follows the local high school football team there. They have a star player named Billy, who is the player that they're depending on to get to the state championship game. Billy, though, comes from an abusive past. He lives in an abusive household, and one of the ways he copes with that abuse is he takes his aggression out on the football field. Well, one of the things you learn early on in the story is that aggression goes a little too far, and he is suspended. And he has these interactions with the head coach, whose name is Trent, of the Denton high school football team, and they're in Denton, Arkansas. And Trent has moved and taken the job. He's moved to Arkansas from California. He's very religious, very spiritual, and he tries to kind of mentor and comfort and kind of be the father figure to Billy. What really sets this book going forward in motion in terms of the plot is Billy's abuser is murdered. He's found murdered. And so that sets off a chain of events throughout the book in terms of who the person might be and why did they want Billy's stepfather, who's the abuser, why would they want him dead? And there's all kinds of suspects. You come to find that Billy's stepfather was not well liked in the community for a variety of different reasons. So there's all kinds of different suspects. But one of the things that Eli does so well here is, yes, this is a book where football is at the center, but this is just powerful storytelling. This is just great storytelling. He grabs you from the very first page, immerses you into this culture and this community of Denton, Arkansas, and all of the expectations and everything swirling around this team for them to be what they are capable of being. And Billy, you get to learn his life, and Trent, as he moves to Arkansas from California with his wife and 2 kids and tries to start a whole new life and get immersed in a culture that he's unfamiliar with. This is just great storytelling. It grabs you from the very first page, takes you all the way through. I couldn't put this book down. I read it in 3 days. Probably could have read it in 2 if I decided to forego sleep. One night I did stay up way too late reading it, but it is a terrific book. And I want to tell you a quick personal story about Eli. So Rob and I had a chance to go to novel bookstore in Memphis and meet Eli right after the book came out. This would have been, I guess, in February of 2022. Well, we had a huge snowstorm that hit Memphis there, and Memphis is about 55 miles or so, sort of northwest of Oxford, Mississippi, where I live. And so we had a little bit of a drive, but Eli had to drive back to Arkansas, where he's from. He's a high school teacher there in Arkansas, and he's a former college football player himself. So he had to drive back to Arkansas that night. Huge snowstorm hits. And yes, we do get snowstorms once in a while in Memphis, Tennessee. And so Rob and I were able to get a copy of the book. We were able to get Eli to sign it. And he was so kind. He stayed and talked to us and answered all of our questions about the book. Even with this driving snowstorm, we could look out the window at the bookstore and see the driving snow, and the temperature was falling. And he took the time to talk with us and answer all of our questions before he kind of slipped out the back door. And we did the same to get back to Oxford and for him to get back to Arkansas. So I'm just telling you that to let you know that he's an amazing person. He's one of the nicest people I've ever met, one of the nicest authors I've ever met. And this is a great book. This is Friday Night Lights meets a murder mystery. You're absolutely going to love it. Even if you don't like sports or football, you're going to love it. If you do like sports and football, you're going to love it. So add this one to your to-be-read pile, Don't Know Tough by Eli Craner. So that's the first book I wanted to share with you. The second book I wanted to share with you is a little bit different in tone and content. This is Anna Quinlan's new book. It's called Write for Your Life. Some of you may be familiar with Anna Quinlan. She is a journalist and has been written for a long time, has written for the New York Times. She's a columnist and has been a columnist for the New York Times. She won a Pulitzer Prize there several years ago for her work. But I love this book because this book gives us perspective and information and advice for why, no matter who we are, what we're doing, what our background is, we need to be writing. And we need to use writing as a way to communicate and to help us understand and make sense of the complicated world we live in and the complicated lives that we all have. So some of the things that she talks about in this book is how, for example, doctors and nurses and surgeons use journals and narrative writing to kind of help them overcome the things that they see and the sick patients that they treat and the patients that unfortunately they lose sometimes as part of their professions, how that is helping them cope. It talks a little bit about how people are using writing and can use writing as places of healing and forgiveness, to forgive other people for wrongs that have occurred in the past, or to use writing as a way to forgive and heal old wounds that exist between family members or between friends or between spouses and all of that. As a result of wrongs that have been done, things that have been said and done to one another. It's terrific. It's a great book. She talks a little bit towards the back end of the story about how students need to approach writing. And no matter if you're a junior high student, elementary student, high school student, college student, why writing is important and why it's important for you at that age to engage in writing and to do some kind of writing every day. So if you are a teacher, a writer, a reader, someone who has children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews that are of school age, you're going to want to get this book and encourage them to read it. It is fantastic. If you know Anna Quinlan, you're familiar with her writing style. She adopts much of that in this book. It's like reading one big long column of hers from the New York Times. Really, really great. Loved it. Really gave me a lot of insight and perspective, and in terms of why do I write? Why do I like writing? And why do I use writing? And maybe how could I use writing differently than I have been before? My only criticism of this book is when you open it up, the pages are double spaced. So let me open this up and just show you an example here. You see these pages double spaced. I don't really like that as a reader. I felt like that in many ways I was reading a dissertation or reading a research paper. And it's certainly not those characteristics or not those modes of writing in terms of content, but that's how it looks when I'm reading this. Everything is double spaced. Now I understand why it was double spaced, because Random House is able then to put it in a hardback form. They're able to sell it for a higher price than a paperback and make more money off of it. So I understand that. I understand that publishing is a business. We'll talk more about that on the channel in the episodes to come. But it just really was kind of annoying to me to see that every page in this book was double spaced. I just didn't like that. I just kind of felt like as a reader, it was difficult to follow. I felt like I was reading a research paper, but in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, oh yeah, Random House is doing this so that they can make this a hardback book and sell it for a little bit more money. So that's a small kind of piddly claim there about that. That's a good West Virginia, Appalachian, Mississippi term, piddling complaint there. But it is something that just to make you aware of, you'll wonder why is this book double spaced if you pick it up. But again, if you're a teacher, reader, writer, someone who writes a lot or likes writing creatively or has to write for their profession, get it for that student writer or that college writer in your life, because she really explains very, very well why writing is important and why we should write every day. This next book that I'm going to talk about is one that I also really loved. And this isn't really kind of the book that I normally would seek out, but you're going to want to put this on your to be read pile. It is by Grant Gender, who teaches creative writing at NYU in New York. It's called Let's Not Do That Again. And this is just a book that is so many things. It is a mystery and a thriller in some ways. It is a story about a overly ambitious political family and the mother of that family who is trying to run for elected office. And some secrets come into her past, some secrets that her family has committed in the past come to light. So I thought I would just read to you just a little bit about this, just a little summary here. Just so you can get a sense for what this book is like. Nancy Harrison is running for the Senate, and she's going to win, damn it. Now that's her slogan, although that's not her slogan, although it could be. She said all the right things. She's passed all the right legislation. She's chapped her lips kissing babies. There's just one problem, her grown children. Greta and Nick Harrison are adrift. Nick is floundering in his attempts to write a musical about the life of Joan Didion. And then there's his little sister, Greta, who's smart, pretty, and completely unmotivated, and she allows life to pass her by like the shoppers at the Apple store where she works. One morning, the world wakes up to Nancy making headlines, not necessarily for the right reasons, because her daughter, Greta, is in Paris and with extremist protesters, and she throws a bottle of champagne through a beloved bistro's front window. And that sort of sets everything going forward. And so Nancy, trying to seek another term in political office, has to manage this. Her daughter, Greta, is wayward and estranged, and Nancy kind of forces Nick to get involved and go to Paris to find his sister. And once he does, you find out really what she's been up to and really why she's been doing it. So it is a wonderful book. I loved it because one of the things that Gender does so well is he creates characters who are so deeply flawed, but they're so remarkably human. They're wholly recognizable. You're going to know someone who acts like these people or has acted like these people. You might even know a politician in your community that maybe has had to deal with something like that, hopefully not too much. Or if you've ever sought office yourself, maybe you've had to manage expectations and manage some of those skeletons in your closet by family. But this is a terrific book. Grant Gender is a wonderful writer. This book just flows by. You'll just turn the pages easily, and you'll want to know about Nancy and why she's allowed this to go on, why Nick is agreed to go get Greta, and why Greta is doing what she's doing, and why she's hanging out with those people in France, and why she ultimately decides to throw that bottle through the bistro window. A terrific book. It's a political satire again, but it's a mystery and a thriller too. It's just wonderful. I just loved it. And again, it's not something I normally would seek out, but Grant Gender is a wonderful writer, and I can't wait to read more stuff that he writes as time goes on. So the next book I want to mention real quick is called The Violin Conspiracy. This is a debut novel by a author named Brendan Slocum. This was a Good Morning of America book club selection. This came out a couple of months ago, I believe, and I'm just late in picking this up, but I love this book as well. This is a little bit of a mystery, kind of a soft or a cozy mystery in that, there's no murder, no one is killed, but this book follows a violin prodigy named Raekwon, or he goes by Ray. And he comes from a family. He lives with his mother and his two infant sisters, and his aunts and uncles that are on his mom's side of the family live close by. And ultimately, he is a violin prodigy. He starts, as he goes through high school, is renowned for his violin expertise. What happens at the beginning of the book is he's playing at a competition. His original violin gets stolen. He goes to his grandmother's house with his mother and sisters and aunts and uncles at Thanksgiving, and his grandmother gives him a new violin. She finds out that his original violin had been stolen, and he is given a new violin by his grandmother, and he takes the violin, gets it fixed up. Long story short, the violin ends up being worth over $1 million. It's an antique. It was his grandmother's great-grandfather's violin from the Civil War. She's held on to it all of these years. And what ends up happening is that other people start making claim and laying claim to the violin. Once the media gets attention of it, as Ray continues to play in New York and Chicago and Washington and get all of these accolades and acclaim and interviews on 60 Minutes and all of this kind of stuff, it's mentioned how much the violin is worth. And all of a sudden, his family members, his mother, his brothers, or his uncles, her brothers, are all wanting money. They're all wanting him to sell the violin and take the money and give them some of the proceeds, because they said, hey, that house, we grew up in that house. You weren't around. You didn't grow up in that house. We grew up in grandma's house. That's technically our violin. And so you have that whole situation going on in terms of them trying to lay claim to it. There's another family, a family called the Marx family, who tries to lay claim to the violin. I won't get into the specifics of how or why that happens. But one of the things I loved about this book, I love fiction that teaches me something and teaches me new things. And one of the things that Brendan Slocum does so well is he takes you into the pressure and the sort of the behind the curtain scenes of what it's like to be a world-renowned musician. And, we see these people in concert. Sometimes we see these people in symphonies. We see these people on PBS playing at the Vienna Philharmonic out in Austria, and we see them in New York with the New York Philharmonic, and we see all these great musicians playing. And one of the things that he does is he takes you inside that world, into the kind of pressure, the amount of practice, the amount of work that goes into this through his character Ray, and you really see that it's not easy, and it's not for the faint of heart. And for you to be one of these talented musicians and be one of these successful musicians, even if you're just a violin player or something else, you learn what commitment and dedication that requires. So I loved learning about how all that works, how relationships are made in that profession, and the kind of pressure and challenge that these musicians are under, how much they have to practice every day. And one of the reasons that Brendan Slocum includes this is because he is an accomplished musician himself. He's also been a K-12 music educator. He has taught music lessons and has taught groups, both large and small. He's got his degree in music education. He was raised in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he has played with a number of those famed orchestras throughout the world. So I loved this book. I loved Ray's character. I loved how he balances the expectations of being this world-renowned musician with the expectations of trying to keep hold of this violin that is now suddenly worth all of this money, while also keeping his family and the Marx family at bay, with them constantly pressuring him to turn over the violin and to sell it for the money that it's worth. So it's The Violin Conspiracy, Brendan Slocum. Loved it. He's working on his second novel, and I'm excited because I can't wait for that. Another book that I've read that I really loved, getting back to more of my Appalachian roots, being from West Virginia and having lived a great portion of my life there, now living in Mississippi, I always love good Appalachian stories. And Lee Cole has given us one called Groundskeeping. And this is a terrific book. And it centers on primarily two main characters. One of those characters is named Owen, who is sort of this wayward person who's been living out in Colorado. He's estranged from his mother and father. While he's been out in Colorado, he's had a lot of low-level jobs that haven't made much money. He's been using and abusing drugs. He's been sleeping out of his car. He's been doing all kinds of things. But he comes back to Paducah, Kentucky, which is pretty close to Louisville, Kentucky, if you're familiar with that area. And he moves back to Kentucky. He's an aspiring writer. And he lives with his uncle and his grandfather, which provides just so many tender and funny scenes throughout the book. And he's kind of eager to kind of clean up his act and try to get his life back on track. And he meets another woman named Alma Hadzik, and she is a writer in residence at the school, the fictional school where Owen works. He ends up working as a groundskeeper. He gets a job as a groundskeeper, which ties into the title, Groundskeeping. He gets a job at the school there, at the fictional college there in Kentucky. He meets Alma, and they begin a love story. These are two people that really are navigating the entanglements of class, the entanglements of identity, trying to find themselves. Alma is Serbian, and so you get all of that involved there. But you also learn about the ties that bind people together. What brings people together? What pulls them apart? Will they stick together? Will they stick with each other when times get tough? You find out if Owen and Alma are able to forge a love affair through the different things that happen to them, through the different expectations that her family has of Owen and the different expectations that Owen's family has of Alma. Just a really, really great book. And this is it again. It's called Groundskeeping by Lee Cole. My only complaint about this book, and again, this is another one of those piddling little complaints. This is one of those books where there are no quotation marks around dialogue. So unless there's a dialogue tag, I had a difficult time trying to figure out who was speaking, particularly if there was a scene where there was more than just Owen and Alma having a conversation. Like if Owen was in a room with Alma and her parents and everybody's talking at once, I had a tough time following who was speaking when. And the same would be true if Alma was with Owen and his family and everybody's talking at once. I had a difficult time following who was speaking when. So that kind of slowed me down a little bit. So if you're one of those readers that kind of needs those quotation marks and needs a lot of dialogue tags to help you keep straight who is speaking, just know that when you pick up this book. Again, it's not a major concern, but it's just something that I'm not familiar with a lot as a reader. So it slowed me down in certain spots, but this is a terrific book. It's Lee Cole's debut. I would highly recommend you getting it, especially if you are familiar with Kentucky or Appalachia. There's so many cultural motifs and so many cultural real world roads and highways and buildings and bridges and all those kinds of things that'll take you back to your Appalachian connections if you're familiar with that. But I really loved that book as well. And that was really kind of more of a romance story than anything else. So I loved Alma and Owen's chemistry and their connection and how they kind of moved 2 steps forward and 1 step back throughout the book and throughout the relationship. So get it, you'll love it. It's a great book, other than the little piddly complaint about no quotation marks, not a lot of dialogue tags. And then the last book I wanted to mention is one that I just finished here a couple of days ago. It is by journalist Ronnie Green, and it's called Heart of Atlanta, and it talks about 5 Black pastors and what they were doing with the Supreme Court and how they were able to achieve Supreme Court victory for integration. And Ronnie Green is an accomplished journalist. He worked for the Miami Herald for a number of years. He also worked for the Associated Press, and now he is an editor, a content editor for Reuters in Washington, D.C. But one of the things I love about Ronnie, he wrote a book back in 2015 called Shots on the Bridge, which was about police trying to control the violence in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, a book that I loved. And something that I didn't know much about. One of the things I like about Ronnie Green is he takes big history stories, big events that we know about from the news and from culture, and goes and finds the unheralded people that oftentimes don't get coverage and don't get attention all the time in the news or in the media or get stories written about them. He profiles them. He profiles these 5 Black pastors. And basically what the story centers on is these pastors are taking a case to the Supreme Court right after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And so I'll just read a little bit of this just to give you a sense of what this book is about. And it says, and now one day after Lyndon Johnson signed the nation's most far-reaching civil rights law in 1964, there were 2 people that were interested in trying to defy this, 2 of them. And these 2 people, one named Maddox and one named Willis, and the pastors associated with us. It says, Maddox braced for more visitors. Black voters had sent him 2 losses at the polls. He summoned all their inner fire to ensure that they didn't conquer them. And as you go on, you learn more and more about Maddox. You learn more about another character named Lewis. You learn another character, Lester Maddox. You learn about another character named Dunn. You learn about the attorneys that are involved. And basically what happens is there was a hotel down in Georgia, and there was a restaurant called the Pickwick Restaurant in Georgia. And the owners of both of those establishments refused to allow Black people to get rooms at their hotel or eat in that particular restaurant. And these 5 pastors, who eventually become 5 Black pastors, they were quite young at the time, they adopted Martin Luther King's philosophy of sort of civil disobedience and demonstrated nonviolent protesting. And eventually what happens, attorneys get involved, the owner of the hotel gets an attorney, the owner of the restaurant gets an attorney, the pastors get an attorney, and this case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And it's kind of bundled together as one case, but it's a case that oftentimes gets overlooked in the civil rights legislation and the civil rights conflicts of the 1960s, and Green explains why that is. I love this because I didn't know anything about these people. I didn't know about this situation and circumstances surrounding it. And the fact that Ronnie Green is a journalist, he writes it in such a way that you feel like you're reading a newspaper story or a newspaper feature story. And in some ways it reads like fiction. So I really appreciated that. It wasn't written like an academic textbook. It wasn't written like a history encyclopedia entry. It was written in very clear, concise, accessible prose. I absolutely love this book. I love history, as I mentioned. If you watched my video introducing the channel, I love history, and I love learning about history that I didn't know anything about, and learning about people and circumstances that I didn't know about. And Ronnie Green gives us another great book that takes us inside to a sort of unheralded story that we haven't heard a lot about, with these 5 Black pastors and the 2 owners of the hotel and the restaurant. And one of the things that I found interesting as you read the book, and you'll see, if you pick up a copy, you'll see this, is that 2 of the 5 pastors are still living. And during his research, Ronnie was able to discover clips and picture footage and video footage featuring those Black pastors, but they oftentimes weren't mentioned or weren't cited. They were just background characters in the story. They were just background characters in the news footage of the time. And Ronnie was able to identify and say, hey, that was you, that was you. And the 2 pastors that are still living were totally surprised that they were even included in that footage or in those pictures. So just a great story that tells us something about that period in American history. And about characters and people that you didn't know about. He also talks a little bit about the Warren Supreme Court, the Earl Warren Supreme Court, and kind of how their progressive activism, they were the kind of the right court at the right time for this kind of case to come to them. And he goes into great detail and explains that. So I would highly recommend that you add that to your to be read pile if you're looking for a little bit of history and nonfiction. So that's what I've been reading recently. Those are some of the books that have stood out to me, and my quick comments and thoughts on them. You couldn't go wrong with any of them. Again, I've read a lot more than that, but I don't want to talk for too much longer about that. But I do encourage you, as we finish up this episode, to leave some comments in the comments fields below. What have you been reading recently? What have you been reading lately that you really liked? What have you read lately that maybe you didn't like, that was hyped up pretty good and you read it and thought, it wasn't as good as I thought? Or what is a book that you've read that surprised you? Maybe you just picked it up and thought, well, this sounds okay, I'll give it a shot, and it ends up being a book that you really loved. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. I pick up a book thinking, I don't have anything to read right now, I'll give it a shot. And I fall in love with the author, I fall in love with the story and the series, and I'm hooked from that point forward. So if you've read some of those books, put that in the comments field below as well. Let's have a discussion, talk about what we're reading, what we like, what we don't like. And also I encourage you, over here to the right, you should see a little subscribe button. Please subscribe to the channel so that as new episodes get posted periodically, those will show up on your YouTube page. Share this link with your friends, other friends that you may have that are big readers and writers. We'd love to have them join the channel, participate in the discussion, and talk about what we've been reading, what we've liked, what we didn't like, and what surprised us as we move through, I guess, quarter number 1 into quarter number 2 of 2022. So thanks for stopping by. Thanks for taking a page break with me. Stay well. See you someplace soon, I hope, and we'll talk again soon.